All right, so here we go with part 2 of our Unit 2 review video lecture. Now we're going to focus on the development of states and empires. All right, so development means changes, right? So how did empires and kingdoms and states grow? How do they change? How do they develop? How do they increase their size and power? How do they maintain control of their territory? How do they decline? How do they shrink? How do they collapse? Right, so development is the rise and the fall and the spread of states and empires. So here we see some of the major empires and states of the classical era. I notice the two largest ones, of course, are going to be the Han Dynasty of China and the Roman Empire, covering the Mediterranean world. Now, before the Romans, there were the Persians, and the Persians, they controlled most of the Middle East, places like Mesopotamia and Persia and Turkey and Egypt, right? And they're going to be the first ones to have a major road network known as the Royal Road, which allowed them to maintain centralized control from their capital. And the emperor can send messages throughout his empire and send soldiers throughout the empire as quickly as possible. Now, the Persian Empire, they divided their territory into provinces known as satraps, and each satrap was ruled by a satrapy, which was a loyal local king or noble that is chosen by the emperor. And to make sure that these local rulers kept true and remained loyal to the emperor even had a spy network called the eyes and the ears of the emperor, who allowed them to keep tabs and make sure that they stayed loyal. And the emperor was given the title the King of Kings, right? So this is what makes the Persian Empire an empire, because it wasn't just Persians living there, because that would be just a kingdom. You had Persians, you had Mesopotamians, you had Egyptians, you had Anatolians, you had a whole bunch of different people living together. Remember, the Persian Empire also, they had the Khanats. Those are the underground canals that allowed them to develop agriculture in the hot and dry areas of Persia. And this technology was spread throughout the Middle East. And they had one of the best bureaucracies managed by people who are appointed by the emperor or the royal family. And these bureaucrats, these administrators, these tax collectors, these law enforcers, all of them, of course, would remain loyal to the empire. So Persepolis was the capital, right? And it was connected throughout the empire through the royal road. And there's going to be different dynasties. But when we talk about the Persian Empire, we normally talk about the Achaemenid Empire. That's the empire of Cyrus the Great. Classical China, there's two dynasties, that is the Qin and the Han, right? They came after the Shang and the Zhao. That's in time period 1. Remember, the Qin, they're going to have Emperor Shi Huangdi. They're going to unite China after it had been divided for hundreds of years during the Civil War era, known as the Warring States period. They're going to be legalist. Remember, these are the people who are going to burn books that they did not like, and they will kill anyone who criticized the government. And they needed to have this violence and this cruelty in order to kind of bring China and force China back together into one unified state. And the Qin is going to be responsible, of course, for constructing the Great Wall. Now, the Han Dynasty, they're not going to be legalists. They're going to be Confucianism, and Confucianism will thrive during this time. And they're going to use the civil service exam to recruit people into the government, into the bureaucracies. So you're going to have a meritocracy, or a bureaucracy of merit, that the most educated, the most talented, not necessarily based on the most educated and talented people are going to work for the government, and not people who are related to people who are related to people in charge. So this is the Qin and the Han, right? They're going to go westward, right, into Central Asia, because they want to be able to trade. So they're going to build the Silk Road, right, from their capital in Chang'an all the way connecting it to the Mediterranean, to the Romans. In classical India, we have the two dynasties, the Mauryans and the Guptas. Mauryans, we see Ashoka. He is going to have a centralized bureaucracy of educated, Buddhist priests as the people running the government. They're also going to have the published laws called the Rock and Pillar Edicts, which is laws written down on pillars of stone. And we're going to see the popularity at its height of Buddhism in India because it becomes the state religion. Now, after the Mauryan Empire collapsed, the Guptas took over, and the Guptas were very, very rich. They had a lot of trade on the Silk Road and on the Indian Ocean, and that means a lot of money could be invested in education and schools. So they have developed advancements in math and science. They're the ones who create the Arabic numerals, which are the ones we use today. They had a lot of advancements in medicine and doing vaccinations and that sort of stuff. And unlike the Mauryans, the Guptas are going to practice Hinduism, right? And they will rule most of India, not necessarily all of India, but most of India, and bring unified rule for a very long time until they both came to an end. Now, in the Mediterranean, we see a lot of city-states. At first, we see the Phoenician city-states, right, where they're going to have city-states on port cities around the Mediterranean, including Carthage. Then we're going to see the Greek city-states rise to power, especially Athens and Sparta. And even though they fought a lot of the times, they also worked together a lot of the times, especially to fight against the Persians. But the Greeks were very decentralized. That is until the arrival of Alexander the Great, who unifies the Greek city-states and launches this massive invasion of the Persian army, or the Persian Empire, and he will eventually develop the Hellenistic Empire. But remember, Alexander was not that good of a ruler, of an administrator. He was a great conqueror, but then he died, and then his empire broke apart into the Hellenistic kingdoms, and eventually those kingdoms, along with Carthage and along with everywhere else around the Mediterranean, will be unified under the Romans, right? And the Roman Empire would rule Western and Eastern Europe and Western and Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, a lot of places until its eventual collapse, right? So we see at first the Phoenicians out in the west, we see the Greeks out in the east, and eventually all this territory will fall to the rule of the Romans. Now, in classical America, in Mesoamerica, we see the large city of Teotihuacan. It was the largest city in the Americas. It was a large city-state, so it was not an empire. And right next door to them in Mesoamerica, we see the Mayans, who also organized themselves into city-states of Tikal and Chichen Itza, right in the Yucatan Peninsula, right in southern Mexico. Now, just like the Greek city-states, they constantly fought each other, they constantly worked each other. They were totally decentralized, though. And so Mayan city-states is not an empire, so there's no Mayan empire. It was just a whole bunch of small city-states, and eventually those will collapse as well. In South America, we have the Moche, which was a kind of like a kingdom, and it is going to continue a lot of the culture of the Chavin, which is the first kind of like civilization in the Andes Mountains of South America. And the Moche are going to, they're going to have the same kind of like agriculture of growing potatoes and raising llamas and alpacas in the coastal areas of Peru in South America. Now, some states are going to have these large bureaucracies, elaborate legal systems, right? And the two kind of like main ones with the largest, most organized, most centralized are going to be the Chinese. They're in the Han Dynasty, and the Romans, right? And they're going to have them, again, the most organized bureaucracies. These governments, the imperial governments, are going to have a lot of military power. They're going to be able to raise their armies from either their local population, like volunteers, or from the conquered people. So they will conquer people and then force them into the military. They would also have a lot of defenses to protect their borders, right? So of course, the Chinese have the Great Wall, but the Romans also built a lot of walls and forts on their borders to protect them against, invaders, and a lot of roads connecting those kind of like the frontier edges of the empire to the heartland, to the main central areas of the empire, so that troops and supplies can move quickly from point A to point B. Now, a lot of these empires, right, you need to have trade, right? So the Han and the Romans, of course, they're going to set up the Silk Road together. They're going to do a lot of long distance trade. They're going to use standardized currencies, right? Everyone using the same coins. They're going to build infrastructure like canals and roads and bridges so that goods and people can move quickly and efficiently as possible. We're going to see the rise of cities, a whole bunch of new cities, larger than ever before. And these cities are going to become increasingly important because they're not just going to be the capitals in many cases, but they're also going to be centers of trade and centers of culture or religion, besides also being centers of political power. So, for example, in Persia, we have the capital of Persepolis. In China, we have Chang'an. In Gupta, India, we have Pataliputra. We have Carthage, Athens, Rome, Alexandria, Teotihuacan, and Constantinople.
Good afternoon, teachers and students. Please pardon this interruption.
Right? So these are some of the major cities of the classical era. Right, time period 2. We also see that all these empires, they're going to have hierarchies. All these states are going to have hierarchies. Where you have the nobles in the top and a lot of slaves and peasants in the bottom. And for the most part, there's going to be very little social mobility for people to move up. With some exceptions like, the patron-client relationship in Rome and the civil service exam in China. Now, these societies, you had to have different ways of producing goods, right? So in Rome, the main way they did was through slave labor, where they had these huge farms called latifundias, where we will now call plantations. And these plantations were worked by hundreds of slaves who didn't own anything and didn't keep anything, and they produced all these goods for the people of Rome at their expense. The Qin also forced people to work, forced them to construct the Great Wall. That was common as well. We see that in order to kind of keep people loyal, the Romans, they would give land and citizenship for people who remain loyal. So if you were like a military soldier, after fighting for a few years, you might be rewarded with a piece of land. If you were conquered by the Romans and you remained loyal to the Romans, then they might give you the opportunity to become a citizen. So there's different kind of like methods of producing the goods you need and keeping people happy so they don't rebel against you. Now, patriarchy continues throughout this time period. One of the more physical aspects of patriarchy is through veiling, right, where women are expected or sometimes mandated to be covered up. And this goes back to ancient Mesopotamia, where the rich women, upper class women, would be veiled so that they can kind of like avoid interaction with lower class men. But the Persians will adopt this practice. The Greeks would adopt it, Romans would kind of adopt it, and eventually we see that the Muslims are going to adopt it in time period 3. Filial piety and paterfamilia, right, that the oldest male in China or in Rome has absolute authority over their family members. Those are, patriarchal ideas. And then in India, we have the custom of sati take place, right? That is that a woman, a Hindu woman, was expected to commit suicide in order to honor her deceased husband, right, when she became a widow. And the idea was that a woman's value was, so little that without her husband, there was no point for her to kind of like keep living. Now, as we see a lot of, wealth come into these empires in Rome and China, we also see the wealth gap widen, especially in Rome, where we see a lot of use of slavery. So the wealthy people who own slaves will maximize their wealth and profit, while the middle and lower class people will always lose out, and they couldn't compete against the slave, because remember, you didn't have to pay slaves anything. And the wealth gap will lead to constant fighting and rebellions and conflicts between upper class and lower class people. Also, we see that as the populations grow and expand, they're going to have they're going to have environmental problems. And we see this especially with the Mayans, who caused deforestation by doing too much slash and burn agriculture as their population grew. Now, external problems also led to the decline and the collapse of these states of the classical era. So, for example, the Chinese are going to be attacked and constantly fighting and eventually invaded by the Xiongnu, right, which are these nomadic people from Central Asia. The Guptas will be attacked and overrun by the White Huns, and the Huns, along with the Germanic tribes, are going to overthrow or overrun the Roman defenses. So external issues brought problems as well to these large empires. All right, so that's it for part número 2. I will see you for part 3 next time.